Hello everyone. From creepy passengers to haunted rides, these Uber drivers have seen it all. In this spine-tingling video, we're sharing the most terrifying stories from Uber drivers who've experienced the unimaginable on the job. From strange requests to eerie encounters, these drivers are bravely sharing their scariest stories that will leave you sleeping with the lights on. So, buckle up and get ready for a thrilling ride into the darker side of ride-sharing.
Report number 1. My name is Renato, and I have been a rideshare driver in Curitiba for almost a decade. Early mornings have always been my specialty, filled with unique stories and characters, but nothing could prepare me for what I experienced on that cold night. It was an ordinary early morning until the clock struck 3 a.m. I received a ride request, an alert that shattered the silence of my cabin. The pickup point was located on a secondary road, a route that circled the São João Batista Municipal Cemetery. With its old tombstones and twisted trees, the cemetery had always been the subject of whispered stories among drivers, but I had never been superstitious. As I drove toward the pickup point, a strange sensation began to settle in my chest. The temperature dropped abruptly, and a chill ran down my spine. The darkness seemed deeper, as if it were alive and watching me. The road was poorly lit, with a single streetlight whose yellow beams cast long and unsettling shadows. The wind whistled through the branches of the trees, creating a lament almost human in nature that made my heart race. As I approached the pickup point, I saw a figure standing under the dim light of the street lamp. It was a woman motionless, in a white dress that seemed to belong to another era. The fabric was long and flowing, as if it had been made for a ball in a distant castle. She was staring at me, as if she had been waiting for me. The moment our eyes met was indescribable. Her eyes, deep and dark, seemed to hold secrets that would never be revealed. A chill ran through my entire body, but an inexplicable force compelled me to stop the car. When I opened the door for her, there were no words. The woman entered the back seat of my car, closing the door with a smooth, almost ritualistic motion. The silence inside the car was thick, as if the air were charged with tension. The only sound was the rumble of the engine, a distant hum that seemed out of place on that night. I tried to break the silence, feeling the need to understand what was happening. "Where are we going?" I asked, but she did not respond. She simply kept her gaze fixed ahead, as if lost in her own thoughts. After a long moment, she extended her hand and handed me a yellowed piece of paper that appeared to have been carefully preserved for years. The paper had frayed edges, and the handwritten words were nearly faded by the passage of time. The address written was Rua das Almas, number 78. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't remember from where. I placed the paper on the seat beside me and continued driving, still trying to understand the unusual situation. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror. What I saw made my heart stop for a moment. The figure of the woman was starting to fade away. First, her outline became blurry, like a painting washed by rain. Then, her image turned into a shadow, a mist that dissolved into the air. Desperate, I blinked several times, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But reality was relentless. Each time I looked, she became less solid, as if she were being carried away by an invisible breeze. The adrenaline surged, and in an impulsive act, I slammed on the brakes, stopping the car abruptly in the middle of the deserted road. The silence was now deafening, and my ragged breathing echoed in the confined space of the car. I turned to the back seat, expecting to see the woman still there, but what I found was a terrifying emptiness. She had vanished, as if she had never existed. The space that had once been filled by her presence was now just an echo of confusion and fear. I got out of the car, the cold of the early morning cutting into my skin. The wind seemed to carry distant laughter, and the darkness around me grew more oppressive with each passing moment. I looked around, searching for any sign of her, but the road was deserted. Disoriented and trembling, I returned to the car. Doubt and fear consumed me. It was impossible for this to have happened. What had I really seen? What had I felt? My mind tried to convince itself that it was all a hallucination. I drove home, still dazed. On the way, I glanced at the passenger seat, and the piece of paper was still there, unyielding. With trembling hands, I picked it up again, and as I examined it more closely, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the back of the paper was a date, 1923. The word echoed in my mind like a synonym for despair. Who was that woman? What did that address mean? A sense of panic began to form in my chest, and a need to understand what was happening compelled me to act. The next morning, I couldn't resist. I searched for Rua das Almas, number 78. The story I found made my blood run cold. The street had been demolished decades ago, but a house that once stood there was famous for a sinister mystery. It was said that in 1923, a young woman vanished without a trace, and her soul was trapped in that place, wandering eternally. Since that night, I have avoided picking up rides near the cemetery. The yellowed paper remains stored in a drawer, a reminder that some experiences cannot be explained. And every time I pass that dark road, I feel that the silent passenger is still watching me, waiting for the right moment to return.
Report number 2. It was a night like any other in Sao Paulo, where the nightlife never seems to rest. I was driving through the city center around 2 a.m., with the radio playing a soft melody to keep me awake. The streets, usually bustling during the day, were deserted, illuminated only by widely spaced streetlights that cast long, distorted shadows on the uneven pavement. The atmosphere was dense and heavy, almost tangible. A sense of loneliness began to settle in my chest when I received a notification from my ride-hailing app. A ride request had come in from a nearby street, Rua de Conciliação, a place I knew well but that was usually busy with bars and restaurants buzzing with life. I drove to the indicated location, expecting to find someone eager to head home. But when I arrived, I realized the scene was desolate. There was no one in sight. The only sound was the echo of my tires against the empty asphalt, and a light breeze blew, making the trees sway in a ghostly manner. I waited for a few minutes, looking around, trying to spot the figure of a passenger who might be hiding in the shadows. The silence was almost absolute, except for the occasional sound of a car passing in the distance, as if the city itself was holding its breath. After a few minutes of waiting, a sense of unease began to build inside me. I decided it wasn't worth staying there. With a hesitant movement, I touched the button to cancel the ride. At that moment, something shattered the stillness of the night. A faint whisper, barely perceptible, came from the back seat of my car. "Take me home," said a female voice, soft and chilling, as if it floated between the echoes of the silence. I froze. My heart raced and adrenaline coursed through every fiber of my being. I quickly turned to look at the back seat, but there was no one. The car was empty as it should have been. A chilling cold ran down my spine. I glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see some movement, some shadow that might have escaped my vision, but the darkness remained still. My entire body was on high alert. Every sense was heightened, waiting to hear that voice again. It seemed impossible for this to be real, but I couldn't convince myself otherwise. A strange feeling that something was terribly wrong enveloped me. Without thinking, I decided to speed away as fast as possible. The car shot down the deserted street, and my chest tightened with tension. Every kilometer felt like time was dragging, as if the city was trying to hold me back to keep me there. The echo of the whisper, "Take me home," still resonated in my mind, and a wave of panic overtook me. I tried to convince myself that I had just imagined the voice, that it was simply the result of accumulated fatigue after hours of driving. But the feeling that something was wrong persisted. Rua de Conciliação flew by quickly through the window, but I could hardly bring myself to look outside. The shadows seemed deeper and the streetlights more distant. When I got home, the lights of the building flicked on like a relief, but the weight of the night still followed me. I parked the car, but before getting out, I made one last check in the rearview mirror. Once again, nothing. When I entered my apartment, the first thing I did was lock the door. My heart was still pounding, and every sound inside the house seemed amplified. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, becoming narrower with every breath. That night I tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. I closed my eyes, and the image of the deserted street and the persistent whisper haunted my mind. The silence became oppressive, and I just wanted the night to end. As the morning light began to fill my room, the feeling of unease still lingered. I thought about going back to driving, but the idea of returning to that street at night terrified me. The female voice still echoed, and the fear seeped into every thought. In the following days, I avoided nighttime rides, especially in those streets. The ride-hailing app became a constant reminder of that experience, a warning not to return to what had been one of the most terrifying nights of my life. But curiosity consumed me. I asked some fellow drivers if they had heard similar stories, and many mentioned rumors about that street being haunted. They said that some souls still wandered there, lost in search of rest. The initial fear slowly turned into a strange fascination. I began researching ghost stories and urban legends, especially those linked to Sao Paulo. I found accounts of people hearing voices and seeing figures in the darkness. The voice in the back seat became a shadow in my memory. I learned to accept that some things have no explanation, and even though I never discovered the truth behind that night, the phrase "take me home" became a part of me, reminding me that sometimes, the darkness of the night hides more than we can imagine. Report number 3. It was just past midnight when my phone buzzed, notifying me of a new ride request. I had been working as a rideshare driver for a few years in Porto Alegre, but there was something different about that night. The air felt heavier and the city's silence seemed deeper. The pickup address was on a deserted street in the North Zone, surrounded by abandoned and decaying buildings. When I arrived at the location, a chill ran down my spine. The shadows of the buildings cast distorted figures on the sidewalk, and the light from the few street lamps that still worked was dim and flickering. The street was completely empty, except for the sound of my car's engine. I looked around trying to spot the passenger, but all I saw was darkness. After a few minutes, a man emerged from the shadows, coming out of a narrow alley between two ruined buildings. He slowly approached, his footsteps echoing on the cracked asphalt. My heart raced, but I tried to keep my composure. It was part of the job after all. The man was tall, thin, and wore a heavy, long coat that reached down to his knees. It caught my attention since the night was hot and muggy. He walked in a nearly mechanical way, as if each movement was calculated. His pale, thin hands were hidden in the coat's pockets, and his face was partially covered by the raised collar. When he got close enough, I finally saw his eyes. I froze. They were empty. There was no shine, no emotion, nothing that could indicate there was life behind those eyes. They were like dark wells, bottomless, staring at me without truly seeing me. It wasn't just the absence of expression, it was as if he wasn't truly there. His eyes didn't reflect the streetlights, as if they were two black holes on his pale face. A shiver ran through me, and for a moment I thought about canceling the ride and leaving. But before I could react, he opened the back door of the car and got in silently. The sound of the door closing echoed too loudly in the middle of that silent street. I swallowed hard and asked for his destination, trying to sound professional. He just pointed forward without saying a word. His pale, thin hand seemed fragile, but the gesture was firm. I hesitated for a second but started driving. The silence between us was suffocating, almost tangible. I could feel the weight of his stare on my back, even though I didn't dare to look in the rearview mirror. The city seemed to have become even quieter as we moved through the empty streets. The atmosphere inside the car was tense, heavy. The air felt dense, hard to breathe. I tried to focus on the road, but I felt a knot in my stomach. With each kilometer we traveled, the discomfort grew, like something invisible was pressing down on my chest. I couldn't resist and glanced at the rearview mirror. He was staring at me, his eyes fixed on mine, unblinking. It felt like a cold knife had sliced through the air. I quickly looked away, my heart pounding wildly. Something about him wasn't normal, wasn't human. Trying to lighten the mood, I asked if he wanted to listen to some music. My voice came out shaky, almost a whisper. He didn't respond, just continued to stare at me through the mirror, his lips motionless as if he hadn't even heard me. My discomfort turned into palpable fear. He remained motionless, his empty eyes fixed on me. I couldn't hear his breathing, and I couldn't see any movement of his chest rising and falling. The feeling that something was deeply wrong only grew, but I kept driving, sweat dripping down my forehead. After what felt like hours, we arrived at the destination. An old, abandoned house on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by tall trees and shadows that seemed to shift with the wind. The house was in ruins, with broken windows and peeling paint, as if no one had set foot there in decades. I parked in front of the rusty gate and turned around to let him know we had arrived. My voice came out weaker than I expected, and my heart pounded in my chest. I felt a chill run through me even before I looked at the back seat. The seat was empty. The man, that stranger with empty eyes, had simply vanished. Fear washed over me, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at the empty space in the back seat, trying to find some logical explanation for what had happened. Panic started to consume me, and my heart raced like it was about to burst out of my chest. I rushed out of the car, looking around, calling for him, but there was no one. The street was deserted, and the wind made the trees whisper eerily. I wasn't sure if I was going crazy. I went back to the car, trying to calm myself, but when I looked again at the back seat, I noticed that the seat cushion was sunken, as if he was still sitting there. The invisible weight of his presence was palpable, and I felt a strange cold take over the car's interior. A cold breeze swept through me, raising the hairs on my arms. It was impossible. All the windows were closed and the night was hot. But the cold seemed to come from inside the car, from a place I couldn't explain. I looked once more into the rearview mirror, hoping to see nothing. But for a brief second, I swear I saw his eyes, empty and lifeless, staring at me again. I blinked and they disappeared, leaving me alone in the silence of the night. That empty stare stayed with me for a long time after that night. I couldn't sleep without seeing it in my nightmares, always watching me without emotion, without a soul. I never knew what really happened that night in Porto Alegre, but one thing is certain. I never accepted a ride on a deserted street after midnight again. Report number 4. It was a hot night in Campinas in the interior of São Paulo. The city as usual had bustling streets during the day, but at that hour, almost midnight, the silence was heavy. I, Rodrigo, a rideshare driver for 5 years, knew every corner, every curve and every alley. I received a ride request in a residential neighborhood, Jardim das Peneiras, a place that was usually quiet, but at that hour, it seemed deserted. When I arrived at the address, I noticed that the house was old, with dark windows and overgrown vegetation that seemed long neglected. A tall man with dark, thinning hair stepped out of the door. At first glance, he seemed ordinary except for his extremely pale skin, almost like a headlight reflecting on a white wall. He got into the car with heavy steps, but his presence was silent. I closed the door and waited for him to state the destination. He said nothing. He just handed me a phone with the address. The screen showed a location in a remote neighborhood, near the Joaquim Egidio district, an area full of winding, poorly lit roads. When I looked at him, expecting a smile or a friendly gesture, he just stared at me with a blank expression. That look, it felt like he could see through my soul. "All right then," I muttered, trying to hide my discomfort. I started the car and we drove off. The silence filled the space between us, growing denser with each kilometer. I usually make small talk with passengers, but something told me he wasn't the type who liked to chat. The GPS indicated that the trip would take about 20 minutes, but the seconds dragged on. While driving, I watched him through the rearview mirror. He kept his gaze fixed on the road ahead, but his eyes seemed unfocused, as if looking through the glass at something far beyond what I could see. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead, but the uneasiness grew in my chest. With each turn we took, the silence became unbearable. I started feeling sweat dripping down my forehead, even with the air conditioning on. Maybe he's not feeling well, I thought, but the idea of asking seemed out of place. I continued in silence, my hands gripping the wheel tightly, trying to focus on the asphalt stretching before us. At some point, I realized he hadn't moved since he got into the car. His body remained stiff, motionless. Not a single movement to adjust his seatbelt or check his phone. It was as if he were frozen. I tried to divert my attention to the road, but the discomfort only grew. As we neared the destination, the feeling that something was very wrong only increased. The trees around us seemed to form restless shadows, swaying to the rhythm of a wind that I couldn't feel. Now and then, I risked a glance in the rearview mirror, but he remained in the same position, unmoving. And there I was, trying not to show the fear building up inside me. We arrived at the destination. It was an old house, almost in ruins, that looked long abandoned. The windows were shattered, and the front was overgrown with tall weeds. I slowed down and stopped the car in front of the rusted gate. I looked at him, waiting for him to finally make a move. I waited, and waited a bit more. But he didn't get out. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "We're here," I said, but my voice sounded strangely low, almost muffled by the heavy air inside the car. I turned my body to face him directly, hoping to understand what was happening. But when I finally looked at him, I realized that something was deeply wrong. His eyes, once vacant, were now wide open, glassy, as if they were locked on some distant point. His face was even paler, with skin that seemed almost translucent. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but panic was starting to take over me. He didn't respond. He just breathed heavily with a damp sound that echoed through the car. A bead of sweat rolled down the back of my neck and I felt my heart racing. The atmosphere inside the car grew denser. The air seemed to be sucked out of the vehicle, making it difficult even to breathe. And then, he broke the silence with a low whisper, almost inaudible. "I shouldn't be here." His words sounded like a lament lost in time. My entire body tensed and a shiver ran down my spine. I looked around, hoping to find a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. The darkness of the night seemed to stretch in all directions, like a shroud wrapping around us. Suddenly, something strange started to happen. The figure in the back seat began to dissolve, like a shadow losing its form when struck by light. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the vision only got worse. His body seemed to dissolve into the air, evaporating into particles that floated lightly before disappearing. By now, my heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. I tried to move my arm, open the door, anything, but the fear kept me glued to the seat. The man, or what was left of him, turned his head towards me, his eyes now glowing with a dim, unsettling light. In the blink of an eye, he was completely gone. The back seat was empty, but the air around me felt heavier than ever, as if he were still there in some way. The dashboard lights flickered, and the car's engine made a strange noise, like something had interfered with its mechanics. What remained was a deafening silence. I sat there, frozen, trying to understand if it had been a hallucination, a dream, or some kind of trick of the mind. But then, I noticed something that took my breath away. The glass on my side window was fogged up, with marks resembling a handprint, as if someone had touched it from the inside. I turned to look at the house again. There was no sign of life there, but something about that place seemed to exude an ancient sadness, a pain that filled the air. It was as if each brick of that house contained a scream that was never heard. I knew I needed to leave before something worse happened. I started the car again without looking back. That whisper still echoed in my mind, I shouldn't be here. Accelerating down the empty road, I felt the presence of that passenger following me, even if unseen. And since that night, I've never accepted a ride without carefully checking the destination. So guys, what did you think of these stories? If you've ever had a creepy experience in a ride-hailing car, don't forget to share it in the comments. And if you liked the video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss more content like this. Until next time.